Vamos a primero dejarle al profesor que se extienda en torno a sus teorías. Vamos a hablar con él en primer lugar sobre su trabajo, sobre el futuro de la investigación en torno al envejecimiento, y después tendremos tiempo para plantear cualquier tipo de cuestión o duda por parte del público que hoy está aquí con nosotros. Así que, profesor de Grey, muchas gracias por atendernos.
The translation has stopped.
¿Tenemos traducción ya? De acuerdo. Muchas gracias por estar aquí, muchas gracias por acompañarnos en Salamanca. Lo primero que le voy a preguntar, siempre habíamos tenido el envejecimiento como una parte inalienable de la vida. Nacíamos, nos desarrollábamos, moríamos, y en ello iba implícito el envejecimiento. ¿Por qué decidió usted atacar el envejecimiento? Curarlo, nadie se lo había planteado hasta entonces.
Yeah. People use the word natural in a very misleading way. Of course, aging is natural, but tuberculosis is natural. You know, starvation and, tigers are natural. But we have chosen to develop ways to live better, longer, more safely, with greater health. And this is just the next step in doing that.
¿Cómo pretende usted, lleva muchos años investigando en torno al envejecimiento, cómo se puede atacar, cómo se puede frenar, de qué manera? Conozcamos algo con respecto a las terapias que está usted investigando en el Centro SENS.
Well, I will give the long answer in a few moments. But the short answer is that we now have the ability to develop new technologies, new medicines, which can repair the damage that the body does to itself, that cause us to get sick and die late in life.
Le vamos a permitir a continuación que haga su exposición y después plantearemos las dudas. ¿Okay?
Yes.
Adelante.
Okay, thank you. First of all, I want to thank you all. Oh, okay, I need your microphone.
Ah, okay.
Okay. First of all, let me thank you all for coming along. I am very happy that there are so many people who have chosen to come and hear what I need to say. And I would like to apologize that I do not know any Spanish, so I must speak in English, but there are some absolutely excellent professional translators in the back there, so I'm sure that you will be able to understand everything. Today, I am going to talk mostly about the work that is happening at Sense Research Foundation, this organization that has been created around my ideas and my work. I will also talk a little bit about the social context of this work, what it means for humanity, why it is so important, and why we should be thinking clearly about the question of how a world would work when we no longer have aging. But I am a biologist, so most of what I want to say today consists of explaining to you what aging is, why it is a feasible, tractable medical problem, something that we should be able to address with medicine in the near future, and the details of how to do that. Of course, I will not get too technical, because I know that most of you are not biologists, but I will tell you enough so that you know that this is real science and not just a fairy tale. I'm going to start, though, by talking about how important this is. At the moment, we don't take aging seriously enough. As you just heard, people are still asking the question, why do we think that aging is even possible to change with medicine? Surely it is some kind of inevitable thing that just happens and we just have to live with it. You know, this is a question that we shouldn't be asking anymore. We should understand, we should all understand that aging really is a medical problem that can, in principle, be solved. And when we do start to understand that, it makes sense to ask ourselves, how serious is the problem? How important is it? And of course, we need to measure it, we need to rank it against other important problems. I have put a few of them up here. These are all important problems. Work is an important problem. I used to work on that problem, in fact. I was originally a researcher in the field of artificial intelligence. And I did that because I thought that it was a very bad thing that most of us have to spend a lot of time doing things that we would not do unless we were being paid for them. You know, I think that it would be better if we could spend our time doing things that we enjoy, like enriching each other's lives. And I still think that's an important problem. But the problem of aging is even more important, and that's why I switched fields. So that's what I'm going to be talking about today. And I'm going to start here. I'm going to start with a question. I'm sure that all of you know that 200 years ago, a lot of people used to die very young. You may not know exactly how many. Let me tell you. 200 years ago, even in the wealthiest countries in the world, more than 1/3 of babies would die before they reached their first birthday, before the age of 1. And of course, many, many people would die in childbirth and throughout life. And now, in wealthy countries and even in the developing world, far fewer people do that. Hardly anybody dies young in the Western world anymore. That's a huge success. We should be very, very happy that we have achieved that. But, of course, we must recognize that, as usual, when we solve one problem that is causing suffering to humanity, we unmask the next problem. We always have the next problem. And, of course, today, the next problem is the problem of the ill health of old age. So the question we must ask ourselves is, why has it been so much more difficult for the medical research community to develop ways to keep people healthy in old age? We have had all this success against infectious diseases that used to kill so many people, and we have had very little success against the ill health of old age. Why is that? Most people would say that this is the answer. Don't worry, you're not supposed to be able to read this slide. The point, of course, is that lots and lots of things go wrong with us late in life. And they go wrong at more or less the same time. So they interact with each other, they exacerbate each other. And it's just so complicated. Most people would say that the reason why medicine has failed to keep us healthy late in life is just because the complexity is so huge that it has overwhelmed what we can do with medicine. And that is kind of part of the answer. I'm not saying it's not the answer. It's part of the answer. But it's actually not the main answer. And I'm going to explain the main answer carefully. I'm going to start here. This is the answer that most people would give to a different question, another question. In this case, the question is, in what ways can we get sick? What is a taxonomy, a classification of sickness? Most people would say something like what you are seeing on this table. They would say, well, okay, there are infectious diseases, communicable diseases, that's column 1. Then there are the genetic diseases that a few of us are unlucky to inherit from our parents, that's column 2. Then there are the chronic, progressive diseases of old age, the things that dominate sickness today in the developed world, and that are the main cause of expense and suffering in ill health in today's world. But most people would then say that there's a fourth category, this thing over here called aging itself. And they think of aging as a completely different thing, nothing like disease. That's why I've drawn this big, thick black line here. And aging itself consists of these very poorly defined, non-specific phenomena like frailty, Or sarcopenia, that's the loss of muscle as we get older. Immunosenescence, the decline in effectiveness of the immune system. These things, people think of them as completely outside of the family of diseases. And in that way, they think of them as kind of off limits for medicine. And that's a very big mistake. And I will explain why. So, let's start here. This is what I just said. People think aging is this natural, inevitable process that's not like diseases. It's kind of like completely a separate concept. But now, if we think about what aging actually is, most people, well, they'll think that it's really some kind of mystery. We don't really understand what aging is. It's not true. We do. We do understand what aging is. The first thing I want to explain about aging is that it is not specific to living things. Most people think of aging as something a bit like consciousness, an emergent phenomenon, something that only exists as a result of the extreme complexity and sophistication that characterizes living organisms. That's not true. Aging is just the same kind of thing in living organisms as it is in simple man-made machines like cars or aeroplanes. Aging is a consequence of physics, not biology. We can see here it is the accumulation of damage, self-inflicted damage, damage that the body generates throughout life, even starting before we're born, as a result of its normal operation. So you can see I could have written exactly the same definition for a car. A car accumulates rust and things like that throughout its life as a side effect of its normal operation. And again, the last sentence is the same for cars as it is for people. The body is set up, just like a car, to tolerate a certain amount of damage without any significant impact on its performance, but only a certain amount. Eventually, there is too much damage, and the body doesn't work so well. That's all that aging is. Now, why have I spent so much time on that? Why do I say that that's so important to understand? Well, basically, I say it because it helps us to understand what we might be able to do about aging. If we use biological terminology, biological words, we can define aging in 3 words like this. We can say that metabolism, which is the word biologists use to cover all of the things that the body does to keep us alive from one day to the next. Metabolism creates damage throughout life, and eventually, late in life, there is too much damage and the body doesn't work so well, we get the pathologies of old age. And I have drawn these arrows in this strange way to indicate that the goal of medicine against the ill health of old age, these pathologies, is simply to weaken this link, to try to break the chain of events between metabolism and pathology. So then the question comes, how would we do that? We can start by drawing the correct version of the table I showed you earlier. This table is exactly the same as the one I showed you earlier, except for one thing, the position of the big, thick black line. All the 4 columns are the same. But the problem with putting the black line in the wrong place is that it gives us a misleading, a wrong impression of what to do about aging. If you put the black line over here, where I had it before, then that does 2 things. First of all, it makes you think that the things in column 3, the diseases, the chronic diseases of old age, are a bit like the things in column 1. They're like infections. So we should be able to develop cures for them that will eliminate them from the body. But that's nonsense, because the only reason why the things in column 3 are chronic and progressive, why they only affect people late in life, is because they're parts of aging. They are consequences of the accumulation of damage, just like the things in column 4. That tells us that we should be thinking of column 3 and column 4 together. They are not different biologically at all. The only difference between column 3 and column 4 is semantic. Column 3 is the aspects of aging that we have chosen to give disease-like names to. And the things in column 4 are the ones that we haven't. That's all. That's all. Now, that's very helpful for thinking about what to do about aging. If we get it wrong, if we say, OK, the things in column 3 are like the things in column 1, let's cure them, then we will try to do what I'm showing here, I'm calling geriatrics, geriatric medicine. We will try to attack the pathologies of old age directly. Now, one look at this diagram tells you that that's never going to work. Because look, the damage here is continuing to accumulate. Metabolism is continuing to happen, so damage is growing and growing. So it is obvious that any attempt, any medicine that tries to attack the consequences of damage is going to become progressively less effective as time goes on. It's just blindingly obvious. But of course, we still spend billions and billions of dollars trying to develop medicines like this, even though they can never work. It's absolutely scandalous. Now, I am not the first person to notice this. More than 100 years ago, a few people started to realize that geriatric medicine was never going to work. And that's why there is a field called gerontology. Gerontology is all about trying to do something about this process of going from metabolism to pathology, but in a different way, a more preventative way. And the basic idea is to clean up metabolism, to slow down the rate at which metabolism creates damage. The inspiration for this approach is from the living world. We see, of course, that some species already age more slowly than others. They generate damage more slowly, and that's great. So the idea is that if we would study the difference between species, or even the difference between individuals of the same species, and if we understood it really well, why certain species age more slowly than others, then maybe we could translate that understanding into a therapy, into some way to intervene so as to slow down the rate at which we generate damage. And of course that would have a great effect. It would postpone the age at which damage reaches this point where people get sick. Great. Except that you have probably noticed that in the past 100 years, the gerontology approach has also completely failed to actually do anything about the ill health of old age. So we may ask, why is that? The answer is obvious. Metabolism is extremely complicated. Any of you in the audience who write software will recognize immediately that this diagram here is the ultimate nightmare of uncommented spaghetti code. There is no way in hell that we are ever going to be able to tweak this system so that it doesn't do the thing we don't want it to do, the creation of damage, without at the same time having unintended consequences that stop it from doing things we need it to do to keep us alive. It's just not going to happen. And of course, this is an understatement of the problem. What I'm showing you here is a simplified diagram of a small subset of what we know about how the body works. And the main thing there is that it's just what we know. Any biologist will tell you that the amount we know about how the body works is a tiny fraction compared to how much we don't know about how it works, even ignoring all the stuff that we don't even know that we don't know. It's just not going to happen. All right, well, that's all very sad and miserable, but if that was the end of my story, I wouldn't be standing here in the first place. So what's the catch? What is the answer? Well, it turns out that there is a third approach. If our ultimate goal is to break the link between metabolism and pathology, then we could do it by breaking the right-hand component of the process, the right-hand process, and that's what geriatric medicine has unsuccessfully tried to do. Or we could try to break the left-hand component, and that's what gerontology has unsuccessfully tried to do. But there is a third approach which involves not actually doing that at all. I have great sympathy for this poor lady down here who can't turn her cell phone off. She's got it now. Well, great. Okay, so what you can do instead is we can separate those two processes from each other. That's what the maintenance approach is. The idea is to repair damage. So if we could periodically go in and eliminate some of the damage that the body is doing, then we're going to be okay. We can let metabolism create damage at the normal rate. We don't have to slow down the rate at which metabolism creates damage. And we also don't have to change the right-hand process. We don't need to intervene in the way in which damage creates pathology because we're not going to let the damage reach the level that causes pathology anyway. By separating these processes from each other, we are effectively sidestepping all of our ignorance about the way that aging works. We don't need to understand these two processes because we are separating them from each other. So that's the fundamental idea, the fundamental concept of how we are going to bring aging under medical control. Now I'm going to go into some details. Because, first of all, I want to explain that this is really common sense. This is an obvious way to go. The main reason why it's obvious comes back to what I said about aging being a phenomenon of physics, not biology. If we go back to non-living machines, like cars, we can see that this is exactly what we already do successfully to keep machines going much longer than they were designed to. This car is more than 100 years old. And, of course, the people who built it did not expect it to last that long. The only reason why it has lasted that long is because it has been owned by crazy people who decided to do much more comprehensive maintenance on it than most people do with their cars. Most people are happy for their cars to decline and decay over a period of 10 years or 15 years, and then they just go and get a new one. But this is not what happened to this car. So we see that it works. Maintenance works. You just have to be comprehensive enough. That, of course, is the hard part. But let me first of all make a societal point. Everything I've said so far, you should be thinking to yourself, well, that's actually pretty logical. In fact, it's pretty obvious. But then you may be thinking, well, if it's so obvious, why do I need to stand up here and tell it to you? Why don't you already know this? And, you know, that's actually a very serious question. Because I believe that the reason we don't already know this is that most of us have decided we don't want to know it. Why would that be? Well, the thing is, since the beginning of civilization, we have known that aging exists and that it's really horrible. But we have also known that we couldn't do anything about it. And furthermore, every so often, somebody comes along and says that they do know how to do something about it, and they've always been wrong. So humanity has had its hopes raised and then dashed many times. And of course, we don't like that. We don't want to think that things are not going to be so bad and then have our hopes dashed. So there is a lot of reluctance today to believe that maybe this time we will actually make it. And that reluctance translates into not wanting to think that this is possible. And of course that translates into not doing anything to make it possible. At the moment, there is a terrible, terrible shortage of money in this field, and that is slowing us down. A lot of people are dying. A lot of people are going to die in the future unnecessarily because this research was not done rapidly enough, as rapidly as it could have been done. So I know that this is very insulting, but it's insulting on purpose. I want you to wake up and be brave. I want the whole world to wake up and be brave and start doing something about the tragedy of aging. All right, back to the science. I have explained that the maintenance approach is much more promising than the older approaches of geriatrics or gerontology because it avoids and sidesteps so much of what we don't know about biology, about how aging happens. But it doesn't sidestep everything. In order for the maintenance approach to work, yes, we don't need to know very much about how metabolism creates damage, and we also don't need to know very much about how damage creates pathology. But we do need to know what the damage is. In order to repair the damage, we need to describe it, and we need then to work out therapies that will actually allow us to repair the damage. And that's where the details come. So the great news, the first piece of really good news, is that we can describe the damage that accumulates in our bodies in just 7 major categories. We can subdivide the problem into 7 sub-problems. Those are the things I'm listing on the left-hand side of this table. Now, I'm not going to go through them all today, but you can still see that they are all very well-defined, clear, concrete biological phenomena. For example, if we look at the top, cell loss. What's that? It's simply when cells die and they are not automatically replaced by the division of other cells. That's all it is. Of course, if that happens progressively throughout life, then the number of cells in the affected organ is going to go down and down. And eventually there will not be enough cells for the organ to do its job. If we want an example of that within aging, a great example is Parkinson's disease, which is a disease caused by the death of cells in a particular part of the brain, cells called dopaminergic neurons. Now, those cells are not replaced, and in fact, all of us lose those cells over time. So by old age, nobody has the same number, that everybody has lost around 1/4 of the dopaminergic neurons they had when they were young. Some people lose those cells a little bit more quickly, and maybe they have lost 3/4 of those cells by the time they are in old age, and those are the people who have Parkinson's disease. So the question has to be, what do we do about that? And of course, you already know the answer to cell loss. You've all heard of it. It's called stem cell therapy. Stem cell therapy is simply the repair of cell loss. It is, we kind of prepare cells in the laboratory into a state, I've got lots of feedback now. Okay, into a state where they know what to do, where we can inject them into the body and they will then divide and transform themselves into replacements for the cells that the body is not replacing on its own. I'm going to take this off because it's feeding back now. Okay, so we therefore need to do the same kind of thing for all of the damage that we have in the body. And the problem is that most of the types of damage which accumulate are not nearly so well understood as cell loss. And the ways to repair those other types of damage are not nearly so well studied or so well funded. The reason why Sense Research Foundation exists is because these other 6 types of repair are not being pursued by other people, or at least not by very many other people. And that has to change, because we can't do it all on our own. I'm going to talk in more detail about one example. It's going to be an example from row 5 here, where I say that we have to worry about waste products inside cells. That's what intracellular means. We are going to do it by putting new enzymes into cells that exist in other species, typically in bacteria. These other enzymes are able to break down waste products that we cannot normally break down, and therefore they will stop those waste products from being poisonous, toxic. So the particular waste product that I'm going to talk about is oxidized cholesterol. Cholesterol, you've all heard of it, it's an important molecule. Most people think that cholesterol is a bad molecule, but that's wrong. Cholesterol is an essential molecule. If you didn't have any, you would be very dead. But unfortunately, cholesterol can be modified in the body by chemical reactions, and sometimes it becomes molecules that are toxic and bad for us. And that is why we get atherosclerosis. Atherosclerosis is the accumulation of fatty material in the major arteries of our circulation, and it is the reason we get heart attacks and strokes. So it is the #1 killer in the Western world. We have to fix that. And the way we would fix it is by making oxidized cholesterol no longer toxic. What I'm showing you on this photograph is part of a cell that has been poisoned by oxidized cholesterol. This cell started out being a perfectly healthy white blood cell, and it went into the artery wall in order to clean up detritus, stuff that was stuck there. Most of that stuff is cholesterol, and white blood cells are very good at processing cholesterol. That's all fine. But unfortunately, there is this small amount of contamination with oxidized cholesterol. And the oxidized cholesterol poisons the white blood cell, and it becomes this. This part of the cell, first of all, the lysosome, becomes full of fat. And when it does that, it stops working, and the rest of the cell fills up with bits of fat. And it becomes this thing called a foam cell. That's the beginning of atherosclerosis. But as I just said, that whole process would not happen, and we would not get heart attacks and strokes if white blood cells were able to process oxidized cholesterol in the same way that they can already process normal cholesterol. So that's what we arranged. What I'm showing you here is an experiment in the laboratory, just cells in a dish, so it's a very early preliminary result, but it's very encouraging. What we did was, we found some bacteria in the soil which were able to break down a particularly important form of oxidized cholesterol called 7-KC, 7-ketocholesterol. And we identified the enzymes that that bacteria had that allowed it to break down oxidized cholesterol, 7-KC. When we had done that, we wanted to put that enzyme into human cells. Now, in order to do that and still have the enzyme work, we have to make a whole bunch of modifications. And it took us several years to figure out what to do. But eventually we got there. So what you're seeing on this graph is an experiment in which we gave cells a certain amount of this toxic molecule, 7-KC. Each group of bars is a different concentration of 7-KC. And the height of the bars is a measure of how happy the cells were. So taller bar means happier cells, more cells, less cell death. So as you can see, if you have more of the toxic molecule, you have shorter bars, more cell death, unhappy cells. But within each group of bars, you can see that the right-hand one is always the tallest. And that tells you that our enzyme worked. It protected the cells from suffering from this poison. The other bars are what are called negative controls. They are, for example, cells that don't have our engineered enzyme, or they have a different enzyme, or they have the right enzyme, but it's not been engineered to go to the right part of the cell. Things like that. And as you can see, those bars are shorter. So this works. And we're very happy about it because it's very promising, and other people are realizing that it's very promising. This work actually was spun out into a startup company which is taking it forward. So we are pretty confident that this is going to really be a cure for the #1 killer in the Western world. Okay, from now on, I'm going to talk a bit about the context of all of this. And in particular, I'm going to be answering these 3 questions. Now, one of the reasons that I have to spend my time on the road day after day, week after week, giving talks like this, is because hardly anybody else is doing so. And you may think, well, that's a bit suspicious. Maybe this guy is actually saying stuff that isn't true, and he just thinks it's true. And certainly 10 years ago, I had a lot of difficulty convincing my expert colleagues that this approach, this maintenance approach, was realistic. But that's not true anymore. First of all, we have published a lot of papers in high-profile, very respected journals showing progress in developing all of these various therapies. You can see some of them here. This is a way of demonstrating recognition by other scientists that this is working. Also, we have a very powerful scientific advisory board of world-leading scientists who are experts in all of these areas that we're working on, and they have strongly endorsed all of this. These people come from all over the world. I want to point out one person here, Maria Blasco, down in the bottom row, who is the head of the CNIO in Spain, good friend of ours, very respected and prominent scientist, and we are very happy that she is a strong supporter of this work. Not only that, other people are now having the same idea. So this is a paper that came out 4 years ago, and it says exactly what I've just told you. In this paper, the authors divided aging into 9 parts rather than 7, but the correspondence is very close indeed. And they did the same thing. They had a list of corresponding therapies that could be developed in the near future to address and eliminate these types of damage. So it's exactly the same idea. But this time, nobody is laughing. Everybody is taking this approach extremely seriously. And this paper is being referenced by other academic papers literally once every 2 days. So, I could be jealous, it's a bit of an annoyance that I haven't had more of the credit for having come up with this idea a long time ago, but I don't really care about that. What I care about is that this is now an accepted, mainstream, orthodox idea. So that answers this question at the top. This is not just me anymore. The second question is quite important, though. What does this mean for longevity? I get a lot of people saying, well, look, what actually matters in life is quality of life, not quantity. People want to live good lives. They don't really necessarily want to live much longer lives. And I have to make sure that you understand that this is the wrong question to be asking. People think today that quality and quantity are alternatives. And of course, the reason we think that is because today, in today's world, that is true in a way. Because plenty of the things that we enjoy doing are bad for us. You know, far too many of you smoke. That's not good, right? You're shortening your lives and you know it. But you do it anyway because you enjoy it. So there is this competition between quality and quantity. But when we look into the future and we talk about medicines, then the opposite is true. Quality and quantity go together. The only way that we will ever live much longer than we do today is by making sure that we live more healthy, that we don't get sick. Being sick is risky, and it's always going to be risky. If you're sick and you stay sick, you'll probably die quite soon, however long ago you were born. So longevity is a side effect. It's a consequence of staying healthy. Now that I've said that so powerfully, I'm going to talk about what it actually means. And I'm going to start, well, I've just said all that medicine may have this big side effect of allowing us to live quite a lot longer, but that's okay, because our lives will be high quality. So, first of all, how big? How much longer are we going to live? Now, some of you may know that I think people alive today, most people in this room have a good chance of living to be 1,000 years old. I mean, that's 200 years older than the University of Salamanca. It's pretty old. But that's not what you should be thinking about. The only reason I say that is because I understand how technology progresses. The therapies that we are working on today, the therapies that I showed you in that table earlier on, will only extend our lives by maybe 30 years. Now, of course, 30 years is a lot more than what we have achieved so far against the diseases and disabilities of old age, but it's definitely not 1,000 years. So where does this number 1,000 come from? It comes from this concept here, longevity escape velocity. Remember that I have told you that these therapies are damage repair therapies. That means that they don't need to be applied throughout life as they would be if you were simply slowing down the creation of damage. Instead, you can take someone who's already 60 or 70 years old, or maybe even older, and you can fix them up. You can really rejuvenate them and take them back to being biologically 30, because you will be eliminating the damage, taking the amount of damage that they have down to the level that it was when they were 30. And that means that you are buying time. It means that they won't be biologically 60 again until they are 90. Now, when they are 90, they will have damage that the therapies didn't work on, because the therapies were not perfect. Damage that is more difficult to repair than the damage the therapies do work on. But that's okay, because 30 years later, we won't be using the same therapies anymore. We will have, let's call it Sense 2.0. The second generation therapies that have benefited from 30 more years of research. So we will be able to take those 90-year-olds who are biologically 60 for the second time, and we will be able to re-rejuvenate them so that they won't be biologically 60 for the third time until they're 150 or something. and so on. It's just a matter of keeping one step ahead of the problem. And it turns out that the rate of progress that is needed, the rate at which we will need to improve the comprehensiveness of these therapies, is really, really slow. I mean, enormously slower than the typical rate at which technologies are improved after they have first been developed. Look at powered flight, for example. Look at the difference between the first plane in 1903 and the planes that were flying in 1933. I mean, they're completely different. And then 1963. You know, I mean, it's really fast once you get the basic idea right, which is what happened with the Wright brothers in 1903. So this is going to happen. And that's why people alive today have a good chance of never getting sick as a result of how long ago they were born. But that means that it's rather important to try to estimate how soon the first version of the therapies, the equivalent of the Wright brothers, is going to come along. How soon are we going to get to longevity escape velocity? And the answer, of course, is I have no idea. You know, in 1900, very respectable, knowledgeable physicists were saying powered flight is completely impossible. It cannot be done. It never will be done. And just a couple of years later, people did it. But conversely, we can look at Leonardo da Vinci. In the 1500s, he said, this is how we can do powered flight. He had good designs, but they didn't work, and they carried on not working for 400 more years. So you can be over-optimistic or over-pessimistic if you are working on pioneering technology. Now, therefore, all I can tell you is a probability. I believe that we have a 50% chance to develop this kind of medicine within the next 20 years or so, just so long as the work is reasonably well funded at this early stage when we are doing the initial proof of concept research. But there's at least a 10% chance that it could take 100 years. So you may think, well, let's wait and see. But that's nonsense. A 50% chance is perfectly enough to be worth fighting for. If you think about the amount of suffering that aging causes, a 5% chance is quite enough to be worth fighting for. So let's get on and actually fight for that work, for that result, because it's going to save a lot of lives and it's going to alleviate an astronomical amount of suffering. So finally, will society let it happen? This is a huge question, because at the moment, people are worried about things like, oh dear, if we didn't have aging, where would we put all the people? Or they'll say, won't it only be for rich people? Or they'll say, oh dear, won't dictators live forever? Or won't it be boring? Things like that. You know, they really say these things. Or they say, how will we pay the pensions? Now, I get very upset when people keep asking these questions. There are two reasons why I get upset. The first reason is that I've been answering these questions on stage and on camera for 15 years, and it's about time people remembered my answers. But the other thing is, the answers are obvious. Please raise your hand if you want to get Alzheimer's disease. That was easy. Please raise your hand if you want anyone else to get Alzheimer's disease. Still no hands. And of course, the same is true for cancer. The same is true for atherosclerosis and osteoporosis and so on. Nobody wants people to get sick. So we must measure this thing. We must say, okay, if we don't want people to get sick, then we have to recognize that we need to manage a post-aging world in which people don't get sick. And yes, maybe we will have problems that are created as a consequence of solving the problem we have today. But first of all, maybe we won't actually have those problems at all. For example, the problem of overpopulation is a complete fiction. There's no way we're going to have an overpopulation problem because the technologies that we are already developing today to reduce pollution, things like renewable energy and artificial meat and desalination, these things are going to allow the planet to have more people, many more people, with less environmental impact. So today we have too many people, but 50 years from now, we will not have a problem of overpopulation whether or not we have aging anymore. I can give similar answers to all of these other questions, but we shouldn't be asking these questions because even if we did have these problems, they would not be nearly so severe, so bad, as the problem of aging, the problem we're solving. In other words, they would not cause nearly so much suffering as the problem of aging causes today. And even if you're not sure about that, even if you think, well, you know, maybe there are scenarios in which the problems that we would create would be so bad that it's better to stay with what we know. Even if you think that, ask yourselves whether you are entitled to make that decision. I say, no, you're not. I say that we have a duty to give that choice to humanity of the future. 20 years, 30 years from now, we may have these therapies, if we develop them. And maybe society will have figured out how to avoid these problems. Or they may have decided that the problems will not be very severe. But if we didn't do the research to develop those therapies, then our descendants, humanity of the future, will not have the option to actually use them. So we will have been responsible for condemning a whole cohort of humanity to unnecessary pain and suffering and death that we could have fixed. And I think it's completely obvious that we have a moral obligation not to do that, but instead to develop these therapies as quickly as we possibly can. We should not be thinking this way. We should be thinking this way, that a post-aging world will be a better world for everybody. Nobody with Alzheimer's, nobody getting Alzheimer's disease. Think about that. Nobody getting atherosclerosis or cancer. The elderly still being youthful, their brains and their bodies are still working, so they can still contribute wealth to society, which means that everybody will be more prosperous. And so on. You know, people won't get bored, because young people today don't get bored. When they are, they go out and find something new to do. And they do that because they can, because they have the energy, the vitality to actually explore new ideas. And the elderly don't have that because they're elderly, and we need to fix that problem. And so on. So I'm going to stop there, and I will be happy to answer questions. But first of all, I want to tell you that I wrote a book several years ago about all of this. The book covers all of the biology of the maintenance approach in great detail. It is written for a general audience with no biological jargon, but yet it's got a huge amount of detail, so it's quite heavy. The good news for you is that it was translated into Spanish a couple of years ago. The Spanish version, El fin del envejecimiento, I can't pronounce it. I can't pronounce it. The End of Aging is available in bookstores, so I hope that you will get it. And I thank you very much for your attention.
Para plantear preguntas para el doctor de Grey, mientras se sienta, yo le voy a plantear también alguna cuestión pero habrá disposición de quien quiera plantear alguna pregunta la posibilidad de hacerlo. Yo le quería preguntar al profesor de Grey, ya que estamos hablando de algo que puede solucionar tantos problemas, como es acabar con el envejecimiento, como es prolongar la vida humana, ¿por qué cuesta tanto encontrar la financiación adecuada? ¿Por qué, por ejemplo, el sector farmacéutico no se implica más en algo que podría resultar tan beneficioso para la humanidad?
I have tried to answer that question today. I tried to do it in a very direct way and said it's basically cowardice, that people are terrified of getting their hopes up after having been wrong about the defeat of aging so many times throughout the history of civilization. I think that once we make enough progress in the laboratory so that people can really see that this will work, then everything will be very different very quickly. There will be this very sharp tipping point where everybody abandons all of this irrational ambivalence about the defeat of aging. But what matters, of course, is how soon we get to that tipping point. At the moment, it's a huge struggle to get enough money to do this research at the rate that we could do it if money were not a problem. So, yeah, I really want all of you to listen to that.
Cualquier pregunta, estamos aquí a disposición del público. Adelante.
Sí, yo quisiera hacernos todos, o por lo menos dejar en el aire una reflexión que creo que es importante. Si todos sabemos que la enfermedad de Alzheimer o las enfermedades degenerativas de aquí a 50 años se van a triplicar, el coste que tiene una enfermedad, tanto para el Estado como para la familia, el coste que tiene una enfermedad de esas está en torno a los 30.000 euros al año. Evidentemente, si multiplicamos la mayoría, o sea, la cantidad de personas afectadas de aquí a 50 años, con eso podríamos mantener perfectamente las pensiones para muchos que podríamos llegar, y a mí me encantaría, por supuesto, a tener los 130 años. Yo creo que es una reflexión que todos tenemos que hacernos. Lo que estamos pagando ahora por este tipo de enfermedades y lo que nos dejaríamos de ahorrar sin tener ese tipo de enfermedades.
You are absolutely right. It is vital for people to understand that if we actually attack the diseases of old age properly, by recognizing that they are not diseases like infections, but instead they are parts of aging, then the financial savings would be astronomical, as well as, of course, the suffering being avoided. Now, many of my colleagues have tried to say the same thing about that over the years, including talking to governments worldwide, and it has not been very successful. I believe that the main reason it has not been successful is that people have not been emphatic enough in explaining that the so-called diseases of old age are actually not diseases at all. They are parts of aging. If the people in government understood that, then they would feel much more they would make a different decision about what to do with the money.
Bueno, gracias por lo que... ¿Sí? Ahora perfecto. Bueno, muchísimas gracias, doctor. Puesto que el tener seres humanos y científicos con su nivel, teniendo este enfoque, es lo que nos puede marcar la diferencia y llegar a tener una sociedad mejor y nos llega un hilo de esperanza en la sociedad. Lo que me gustaría es que nos dijera lo que piensa que puede intervenir en lo que es la medicina moderna, en la que verdaderamente se trata las enfermedades, simplemente no se trata de dónde han venido, si no simplemente son los síntomas, simplemente son fármacos que tienen efectos secundarios que destruyen mucho más de lo que verdaderamente solucionan, como puede ser la quimio, etcétera, y que no puede haber otras alternativas de medicina natural, de medicina preventiva, de medicina biológica para verdaderamente solucionar esto. Muchísimas gracias.
Is that a question?
¿Era ser una pregunta o una reflexión? Su opinión al respecto de esta reflexión. Parece que está de acuerdo. Vamos a ir con otra pregunta. Yo le quiero preguntar mientras continuamos con las preguntas.
Well, sure, I agree. Yeah, obviously I agree. Well, thank you for your thanks.
Le quiero preguntar al profesor si estas teorías, estas terapias, mejor dicho, que se están desarrollando de cara a acabar con el envejecimiento, podrían ser después asequibles al común de los mortales. Es decir, si no estaríamos invirtiendo muchísimo dinero en una medicina que al final solo va a estar al alcance de unos pocos bolsillos.
Right, so this is an extremely important question, and the answer really comes down to the answer I gave to the first question, the question about Alzheimer's disease. The cost, the economic cost of aging is just as astronomical as the humanitarian cost, the cost in terms of suffering. If people did not get sick when they got old, they would be able to contribute wealth to society, as well as, of course, we would save in other ways. The kids of the elderly will be more productive because they will not be spending time looking after their sick parents. And we will not be spending all the money that we spend today trying to keep sick people alive because they won't be sick in the first place. So by many different measures, we will be a far more prosperous society. And that means that when these therapies come along, governments will have no choice. Even ignoring the humanitarian imperative, which is what will make sure that the right government gets elected, even ignoring that, just looking at the purely mercenary economic arithmetic, it would be suicidal for any country to allow these medicines to be restricted by ability to pay. Today, of course, modern high-tech medicine for the elderly is, in general, restricted by ability to pay, even in egalitarian countries. But that's because that medicine doesn't work, and therefore the economic arithmetic that I just described does not apply. If you want to look for something that is a valid precedent for the logic I just described, you should look at basic education, which is something that, again, if you don't educate your kids as a country, then you're going to be bankrupt in 20 years. And so even a country like the USA, which is not very egalitarian and doesn't like taxes, even there, basic education is free for everybody. It will be like that.
Hola, ¿se me oye? Sí. Buenos días, muchas gracias al doctor de Grey por su conferencia y a la Fundación por invitarnos a esta magnífica exposición. Yo tengo dos preguntas muy breves, además en formato pregunta, no reflexión. La primera de ellas es si en su equipo de trabajo, en su fundación, en su centro de investigación, en su equipo de investigación hay científicos sociales como demógrafos, sociólogos o de cualquier otro tipo, e incluso filósofos, si existen o no y por qué, sería mi primera pregunta. Tanto si existen como si no. Y la segunda, a lo largo de la historia, los avances científicos, todos ellos desde mi punto de vista muy positivos para la humanidad, han tenido malos usos y malos usos muy graves que han generado desigualdad, guerras, contaminación, etc. Y yo le quiero hacer una pregunta muy íntima al doctor de Grey, es si él ha pensado alguna vez en las consecuencias del mal uso de estos avances científicos, si está dispuesto a soportar esas consecuencias y si tiene pensado alguna medida para que eso no ocurra. Gracias.
So, for the first question, we have only done a small amount in our own foundation on sociology and demography and politics and so on around this. But that does not mean we do not think it's important. I spend a lot of my time at conferences and in discussions with people in those fields, and I think that it is vital for those, the specialists in those areas to be well informed about the progress going on the biological side so that they can do the right kind of analysis, the right kind of study of what the consequences could be, and so that they can prepare society appropriately. And I am pleased to say that I am able to have more and more of those discussions. So even though we do not directly fund much work in those areas, we do very much make that work happen. With regard to the possible bad consequences, some people have made this, voiced this concern, but they never quite say what the bad consequences could even realistically be. I think that actually the only time when we end up regretting that such and such a technology was developed is when it's a technology with which a small number of people could do a large amount of damage in a small amount of time. If any of those three criteria are not true of a particular technology, then I don't think that it ever becomes a problem in the long run. Maybe it will be a bit of a problem temporarily while we are figuring out the best way to use it, but one way or another we will figure it out. So let's take the Industrial Revolution. You know, it was quite messy. A lot of people lost their jobs. A lot of people didn't like it. But today, hardly anybody says that the Industrial Revolution was a bad idea.
Siguiente cuestión.
¿Se me oye? Vale. Lo primero, muchas gracias por la conferencia que ha dado. Y mi pregunta, primero la voy a enfocar. Hoy en día salen muchos estudios demostrando que enfermedades como el cáncer están estrechamente ligados a factores ambientales, ya sea la contaminación, el tipo de alimentos que consumimos, ligados al estilo de vida que llevamos hoy en día, sobre todo en los países más desarrollados tecnológicamente. Mi pregunta es si todo lo que ha explicado, esa prevención de daños respecto al propio proceso del metabolismo, tiene en cuenta estos factores, sobre todo el tema de la contaminación, porque alteran el organismo propio. Muchas gracias.
There is a lot of focus on the role of lifestyle in altering how long we stay healthy and how long we live. And it is an important area of study. Certainly there are obvious ways in which you can shorten your life by the wrong lifestyle. I mentioned smoking, obviously getting seriously overweight, having a bad diet, or these things, you know, but you knew all that already. The thing that we should focus on is the fact that the differences which are caused by these things are quite small, really, compared to what we are talking about now. If we ask what is the main reason, what are the main reasons why we accumulate damage, it's not because of pollution, it's not because of lifestyle. Those things play only a small role. Let me tell you what you are doing now, which is the single biggest contributor to your aging. You know what it is? Breathing. Breathing is really bad for you. because it is the main reason why the body creates free radicals, toxic molecules that cause damage to DNA and proteins and so on. But breathing is non-negotiable. Everybody's got to do it. So that's why we have to step in a different way and repair the damage that is caused by breathing. And it's the same kind of damage that is also caused at a slightly accelerated rate by bad lifestyles. So really, it's the same problem.
Bueno, buenos días y gracias por la conferencia. Y yo veo aquí un problema, bueno, varios, ¿no? Pero bueno, el principal y más concreto, bueno, la propuesta parece ser que para mantener, llegar hasta la vejez y longevidad y más, se necesita que, la propuesta es que las células siempre estén sanas, siempre, y como una máquina, como si fuéramos un coche, pero no sé, no parece suficiente eso como para, porque vamos, el cuerpo no solo son células, somos toda una constitución de más cosas y no es tan fácil como cambiar solo partes y el cuerpo se deteriora. Entonces, ¿qué llegaríamos a la necesidad de cambiar nuestras piezas como brazos o no sé si han pensado eso?
Right, so you are making the mistake of thinking that replacement and repair are different things. Actually, replacement and repair are the same thing at different scales. You know, if you replace the engine of a car, then you are repairing the car. But if you replace, let's say, the spark plugs of the engine, you are repairing the engine. It's just a matter of the scale at which you look at it. So, for example, we may be able to rejuvenate the liver just by replacing the liver, doing a transplant. That's not the ideal way to do it, though, because it's very invasive. It would be better if we could simply repair the liver by replacing cells, by using stem cells, for example, to replace cells in the liver that were unhealthy. Or maybe even at the subcellular level to remove molecules that were unwanted, that were waste products. You're right that the body is not just cells, there is also stuff between cells. And if you look closely at my 7 types of damage, 2 of them specifically are focused on aging of the stuff between cells. So absolutely, we have to be very careful not to oversimplify, but the classification that we are working on and that I talk about is not an oversimplification. I have been challenging my expert colleagues to find problems with this classification for a long time, and they have not done so. So we're pretty confident that it's not too simple.
Yo le quería preguntar al doctor por una parte que es difícil, si no imposible, de reemplazar. No se puede hacer un trasplante, por ejemplo, de cerebro, que es una materia además muy plástica. Estamos hablando de ir renovando poco a poco el cuerpo para conseguir una mayor longevidad. ¿Qué ocurriría con el cerebro? ¿El cerebro se podría actualizar a la misma velocidad que el resto del organismo? ¿Podríamos seguir estudiando con 120 años, o sea, hacer una nueva carrera, acumular doctorados? ¿Esto sería posible? ¿O tiene un límite físico el cerebro?
So, first of all, you're quite right to mention the brain. Obviously, the brain is the one organ that we could not replace all in one go. That would defeat the object. But the brain is just as amenable to repair by stem cells, for example, as any other organ. Now, you ask about, essentially your question is, would the brain fill up over time because of just living so long? But the brain does not work like a computer's disk. The brain has a kind of holographic memory where each individual memory or aspect of our personality or whatever is stored in a distributed way across many different cells and the connections between the cells. So that means that we are already, as adults, we are already forgetting things just as rapidly as we are learning new things all the time, because we forget things if we do not remember them, if we do not recall them. Recalling a memory reinforces it, so of course you end up keeping it. But that's okay. You know, I can't remember most of the names of the people I went to high school with, but that doesn't bother me. Okay, that's okay. So we are already in equilibrium, and we will just stay that way. Of course, we will forget more and more things, but we will learn more and more new things. Nothing will really change.
Muchas gracias. Felicidades por la conferencia, ha sido muy interesante. Yo le quería preguntar, ahora que está en plena campaña de captación de fondos para el proyecto 21, ¿cómo percibe que están respondiendo a los fondos de inversión de Silicon Valley y las grandes empresas tecnológicas? ¿Nota que están realmente interesándose por estos temas? Muchas gracias.
It's getting easier, it's getting better. There's still a long way to go. It's very hard to persuade people to give money away, especially the wealthy individuals who have made a lot of money through businesses, through industry. They believe in capitalism, they don't necessarily believe in charities. It's getting easier because we are succeeding now in bringing more and more of our projects to the point where we can spin them out into startup companies. But still there are many vital projects which are not yet at that stage, which are not yet ready to be invested in because the time frames are too long and so on. So it is still absolutely essential that people should support this early stage work philanthropically, as well as making investments in the commercial companies which are taking the next steps.
Le agradecemos mucho la conferencia y quería preguntarle qué opinión le merece, porque aunque estamos encantados con este planteamiento que nos ofrece, qué opinión le merece que a la mucha distancia que hay, si hubiera estaciones intermedias en el sentido de estas pastillas que parece que rejuvenecen las células, y también si en su investigación contempla otra estación un poco más alejada, que sería la hibernación, es decir, una persona que fallece, que no fallece, sino que se le interrumpe la vida porque su enfermedad no tiene cura o en un accidente de tráfico. Si esa posibilidad la ve usted factible cara a poder llegar hacia mayores metas.
Sure. So, well, there are several types of intermediate stage. One of them, it's very important to understand that these types of damage are not completely independent from each other. I often talk about them as if they were independent, just for simplicity. And certainly it's true that any one of these 7 types of damage would be able to kill us pretty much on schedule, even if we fixed all the others completely. But equally, if we fix any one type of damage, that will have some secondary effect on the rate of accumulation of the others. And especially there will always be certain people who are suffering disproportionately from one type of damage, and those people will benefit if we fix that one type even before we have successfully fixed the others. So that's one type of intermediate thing. The type that you referred to in your question, though, is rather different. You seem probably to be talking about cryonics, which is the idea of taking someone who is very sick and they have been declared legally dead, and then freezing them down to a very low temperature so that, yes, they're very sick, but they're not getting any sicker because they're no longer decaying, they're no longer accumulating damage. Now, of course, you have to be awfully sick to be declared legally dead, but still, if you can stay at that level of damage, then medicine of the future may very well be able to fix that. That's why the medical profession has needed to change the definition of legal death over the years as technology has improved and we have been able to bring people back from a point that used to be considered irreversible. So yes, I think this is a very plausible approach. There is very prominent and important work going on to make cryonics more feasible by reducing the amount of damage that is done as a part of the freezing process. And I believe that it will actually become realistic fairly soon.
Gracias por la conferencia. Y la pregunta era, digamos, durante el último siglo ha habido un aumento de la esperanza de vida considerable con la tecnología, pero también parece que ha aumentado muchos trastornos psicológicos, como puede ser de estrés, de ansiedad, y que parece que son en parte causados por los cambios que estamos haciendo a nuestra naturaleza y al medio ambiente. Entonces quería preguntarte si has considerado qué implicaciones podría tener, no tanto para el bienestar físico, que son evidentes que son positivas, sino para el bienestar psicológico, que una persona viva 1000 años.
All right, so the first thing I want to emphasize, which I said in my talk, is that longevity is a side effect of health. So let's suppose that this kind of problem does arise. It's the kind of problem I'd like to have. It's a much more attractive kind of problem than the problem of getting Alzheimer's disease. But more than that, we're only going to get older at 1 year per year. You know, we're not going to have anyone aged 1,000 for another 900 years at least, whatever happens. And a lot of things can be done in 900 years. So it's really kind of inappropriate to be concerned about how someone's psychology would work when they were 1,000 years old. Now, of course, you're right that there are more psychological problems now than there used to be. Or maybe we're just paying more attention to them now because the problems that used to occupy our attention have been solved. The problem of infant mortality or whatever. But still, yes, they are important. Now, I'm not a psychologist, but I'm very pleased that there are psychologists out there who are studying these things, looking out for them, and figuring out the best way to alleviate those problems. And I'm sure that that will continue to happen.
Vamos a ir con otra pregunta. ¿Quién quiere preguntarnos? ¿Dónde está el micrófono? Tenemos varias cuestiones. Ahí al fondo, adelante.
Vamos a ver. Muchas gracias por la traducción que nos ha dicho la señorita. Gracias por la conferencia. Y yo le quería hacer una pregunta que a lo mejor le sorprende a toda la audiencia, pero yo soy una persona mayor, voy a hacer 85 años. Entonces mi pregunta era si en su institución, en su entorno, captan ustedes que la juventud se preocupe por estas cuestiones de la gente mayor, porque cuando la gente es joven, y yo también he sido joven, no nos acordamos de que vamos a llegar a ser viejos. Entonces, ¿qué sucede? Yo le pregunto si ustedes captan de que la juventud o enseñan a la juventud a que se interese por estos problemas que tenemos los viejos y los mayores, para que en un futuro ellos no sufran las consecuencias que nosotros, porque no hemos sabido, porque no nos han enseñado, hemos sufrido y hemos envejecido antes que lo que teníamos que envejecer. Nada más eso.
So actually, it's getting better. You're right, the young people are not necessarily very aware of aging, but they are more aware than they used to be. And they do have one big advantage over the elderly. The young have not learned too much about failure. So they have not lost the ability to aim high. They're not scared of failure as older people tend to be. And that means that even though they recognize that aging may not really matter to them, they still think about it. The big danger for the young is not so much that they think that aging is unimportant. The problem is that they feel overly confident that the problem will be solved before it actually affects them. So they know that people like me are working on it, and they trust people like me to get the job done in time for them. Which means that for me, the important thing to do is to get young people to care not only about their own health, but about the health of people who are older than them and who might not benefit unless these therapies are developed quickly. Now, actually, the same problem exists at the other end of the spectrum. So I'm delighted that you asked your question at the age of almost 85, because most people your age would not ask that question. Most people your age, in my experience, have given up on this whole thing, and that's largely because they think, well, even if these therapies are possible and they could be developed, they won't be developed in time for me. So I want young people to care more about people who are older than them, but I also want old people to care more about people who are younger than them, so that the people in the middle who could really benefit, where the question of the rate of progress of this science makes the most difference, those people will actually benefit.
Bueno, tenemos que ir acabando, que el doctor de Grey tiene que marchar. ¿Tenemos alguna pregunta allí? Sí, adelante.
Oye, se ve que usted tiene muy bien estructurado todo esto y tiene muy claro que de aquí a un par de años va a poder hacerse. Pero mi pregunta es si también usted se ha planteado si realmente esto es algo que queremos llevar a debate antes de llevarlo a cabo, para saber si realmente queremos hacerlo.
Well, so the question of whether we should discuss it, I mean, presumably you mean whether society should discuss it and then do it if we decide we should. That's a strange question, because the fact is we have already discussed it. The discussion is, do we want people to get sick? And the answer is no, we don't. Society has already demonstrated that we want medical research to happen, to stop people from getting Alzheimer's, to stop them from getting cancer and so on. We spend huge amounts of money on that. The only thing that we have not decided as a society is the most effective way to achieve that goal. Now, you could say, well, maybe we have not discussed the scenario in which we really, really succeed. We have only discussed the scenario in which we do a little bit better at preventing those diseases than we do today. But I don't think that's true. Sometimes when people say this to me that, oh, they're not sure about this anti-aging stuff, what I actually tell them is that they are trying to say that medicine for the elderly is only a good thing so long as it doesn't really work, and that medicine for the elderly that really did work would be a bad thing. But they never admit that that's what they're saying. Nobody really wants to subscribe to that point of view. So I believe that the discussion you're talking about has already occurred.
Doctor, ha sido un placer contar con su presencia aquí. La verdad es que esto es un debate que va más allá de la medicina, también incluye cuestiones éticas, filosóficas, incluso políticas, que no nos ha dado tiempo a tratar. Le damos las gracias por habernos acompañado por esta interesantísima charla.